Good evening, everyone. Welcome back. And Nellie and I and Una all hope that you had a wonderful March break. It was the March break that you wanted and needed, and that you arrived back at work this week feeling refreshed and well. And we are very grateful to have you here with us tonight. So we acknowledge that ONLit's work takes place on traditional Indigenous territories. We acknowledge that there are 46 treaties and other agreements that cover the territory now called Ontario. We are thankful to be able to work on this land, and we are thankful to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people for their care for and teachings about the earth. This acknowledgement reminds us of our responsibilities to our relationships and to the ancestral lands on which we learn, work, and live. A quick reminder that we are members, obviously, of ONLit. You wouldn't have guessed that. If you are new to ONLit, we are a joint project between Dyslexia Canada and IDA, or International Dyslexia Association of Ontario. And our role is to support educators with we usually say new, but it's not really that new anymore, revised language curriculum. We prioritize research-driven practices in Ontario schools, and our goal is to bridge research to practice to support equitable student outcomes for all students. We consider it an honor and privilege to do this work as we support educators in order to improve reading outcomes for all of our students. And of course, ONLit receives its funding from the Ministry of Education, and we're grateful for that. Here we have, I think Una's going to pop in the chat box for us. Una's joining us from Fredericton, New Brunswick tonight, where they're doing some really exciting work in that province. All of the recordings for all of our, not episodes, sessions are in the library right now. And so Una's going to give that in case you've missed any. And so we thought that we would begin, as we did with last session, with some retrieval practice. And of course, remember that retrieval practice is that strategy of intentionally recalling facts, concepts, or events from memory, rather than passively rereading or reviewing in order to enhance student learning. And when I think back to how I studied when I was younger, there was a lot of passive rereading and reviewing, and my marks reflected that sometimes. This act of retrieving something from our memory actually strengthens those connections that are holding it there, making it more likely that we'll be able to recall it in the future. So we're going to ask you to take a moment and try to recall and pull from your memory the different stages of the instructional hierarchy. So if you can remember any of the stages, please type the color of the square and the corresponding stage name in the chat. And if you aren't able to recall which one goes where, but remember the name of a stage, please put that in the chat. So we'll give you a quick second to retrieve some of that. Good job. Maybe you're at home thinking like, oh, I remember one of them. Feel free to just be aware of that or to pop it in the chat. Thanks, Debbie, for getting us started. Okay, thank you so much for sweating the brain a little bit there. So the instructional hierarchy is a well-established model of skill acquisition, and we're talking about any skill there, from printing to multiplying using the standard algorithm, the skills involved in reading and driving a car. The hierarchy has been researched for decades. When we learn something new, we move through that predictable series of stages. And it's important for us as educators to be aware of the instructional hierarchy because we are most effective when our instruction matches where the students are, what stage they're at. And so just a quick reminder about the stages. When students are at the beginning of their learning of a skill or a concept, they are slow and inaccurate because they have limited knowledge of that target skill or knowledge. And this is the acquisition stage, which Debbie, you got, good for you. And then we move on to the fluency stage, where students are now accurate with that target skill, but they're slow and not yet automatic. And so they need lots of practice to build accurate and fast performance. And finally, the generalization and adaptation stage, where students apply and practice fluency in a new context and setting. In adaptation, students can perform the skill across settings with accuracy and proficiency. And once we have acquisition, once we have that fluency, students can generalize and adapt it. And of course, depending on which stage students are in, that will determine the types of instructional strategies that are best suited to support their learning in order to move them on to the next stage. And we want to continue to bring attention to this model because it really is applicable to a wide variety of skills, concepts, and knowledge across all content areas, and not just things related to literacy. And so with that, welcome to session 5, which is our second last session together. So we're going to start off tonight by exploring how to teach our students to gather evidence from, first, literary text, which is chapter 4, and then we will look at a few activities from literary text, how to gather evidence from them. And of course, there are an abundance of activities, so we've decided to really just focus in on, I believe, one in each area. Next, we're going to look at informational text, which was chapter 5, and again, we've chosen one activity to practice that. And then finally, we will summarize and wrap up. We're going to continue our learning and deepening our understanding of how to teach students these skills that they need in order to be able to read and understand complex text with this excellent book by Dr. Heidi Ann Mesmer. And we want to remind you that Dr. Mesmer was a guest on IDA Ontario's Reading Road Trip podcast just this last season in season 3. And she spoke with Kate about reading beyond the early years, which would go so well with everything that we've discussed so far. So tonight we're going to be looking more closely at teaching students how to gather evidence from text. Nellie's going to get us started.
Awesome. Thank you, Leigh. Yeah,
Okay.
I was just figuring out how to unmute myself. The button had hidden away. Okay, so we are going to start with chapter 4, which is, of course, the chapter on literary text. We will begin straight away with our first takeaway, which is that students are not accustomed to justifying their inferences with evidence from the text. They may have implicit understanding, but trouble articulating how they know what they know. And perhaps we didn't do enough of this, which is to say, insisting that students provide that justification or proof by pulling evidence from the text. And this is why Dr. Mesmer says in the chapter that textual evidence has taken center stage because for too long we've allowed superficial answers, opinions, and rehashes of prior knowledge to masquerade as comprehension. So, this just really helps me keep in mind personally, even at the earliest grades, because I'm a 1-2 teacher, even just orally, to be prompting students or asking them always to follow up with a phrase as simple as, what makes you say that? Or what makes you think that? And insisting on the addition of that word because to extend their statements can be really powerful. We've also chosen to include Dr. Mesmer's definition of text evidence, despite the fact that it may seem obvious. So textual evidence is information that comes directly from a story to support an inference, characterization, opinion, answer, or prediction. So again, this would be the part that comes after that word because, right? Because when we're asking students to do that, it's forcing them back to the text to justify what they're saying. So a little bit about text-based questions now. She describes text-based questions are questions that require us obviously to read the text in order to formulate an answer. They're not opinion questions or wonderings about the reader's personal experiences. Dr. Mesmer describes text-based questions as a tool. So a tool that helps students use evidence in the text to analyze or support an opinion or a claim, or to help them clarify information. She explains that not all text-based questions are created equal. So we can have both implicit and explicit text-based questions. And Leigh and I had a bit of a back and forth chat about this when we were reading through the chapter and preparing for tonight. There is a chart on page 94 that helps flesh this out. And it outlines 3 types of text-based questions. So first, there's the think and search, where the answer is found, the evidence is found in multiple places in the text. The right there questions, the answer can be found explicitly stated in one specific spot. And then the third type is the author NU question. Um, and this is the one that Leigh and I had a good chat about, because we didn't typically think of this as a text-based question because it's text implicit. So the answer is not explicitly stated. Some inferring needs to happen. Some, students need to make an inference. So it was neat to see that this is also, in fact, considered a text-based question. And then the fourth, and again, I'm referring to that figure on page 94, the fourth type of question, the on my own, is the only type of question that is not text-based, because it comes entirely from the reader's own opinion. Another misconception maybe is that text-based questions have very simple answers, when in fact she explains that they can produce creative answers that show critical thinking and deep understanding of text. Finally, although valuable, she reminds us that text-based questions, of course, shouldn't be the only type of question that we're using in our instruction. And I will pass it over to Leigh.
Thanks, Nellie. So when we look at fictional text, it is the macro structure of the text that supports, no, I'll leave it there, that supports the reader in knowing where to look and what to look for. So the ability to find evidence in a text requires that students understand the purpose and or the structure of that text. And fictional texts usually have that predictable structure that we can teach students, and include the setting, a series of characters, the problem faced by the protagonist, and a solution or an attempt at a solution, and finally some sort of resolution. And as always, we want to connect our learning back to our Ontario language curriculum. If we look at strand C3, critical thinking found in comprehension strand, we can see that the students must analyze increasingly complex literary and informational text as they move through the grades. In grade 1, students analyze simple text, including literary and informational texts, by identifying and sequencing important information and events. And by the time they hit grade 9, they're analyzing complex text, including, again, literary and informational text, by assessing credibility, reliability, and significance of information, and use that to formulate conclusions. So as always, we want to be aware of the learning goals that we are working towards with any of our instruction. And the first two on here include metacognition. So with the first, we want students to recognize that they need to monitor their reading. That's an ongoing process, and that they're discriminating or noticing when they've not understood, and so need to look back in text, or just recognize that that information is important and warrants a second look or a third look. And of course, be able to locate specific evidence to support ideas.
Okay, wonderful. So now we are actually going to highlight the activities in the chapter, and there are plenty of them. And as Leigh said in the beginning, we're going to hone in on one in a moment. The activities are broken into two sections. So here's the first section, or first chunk of activities. So these are meant really to support students in developing that habit of mind, the knowing that they have to look back or should look back to the text in the first place, and then also knowing how to do that. So building that understanding that they need to use the text, not just read it once and then somehow be able to remember everything that they will need in order to engage with it. So we have student-generated questions. And in the text, she goes into far more detail about different types of questions that students can generate. And we will come back to this strategy when we talk about informational text and chapter 5 a little bit later. It is also important to note that Dr. Mesmer she says that students actually grow the most when they ask questions as they read. So again, we're going to come back to that in a little bit. Directed reading thinking activity. So this is basically a cycle strategy where students, we've all had students make a prediction before reading. So they're doing that. Then they read a portion of the text and decide if there is support for their prediction or not. And if there is, they then go and find the evidence. So it's a really generic strategy that can be used with almost any text. The look back strategy is exactly as it sounds, except she has it explained as guided by 3 questions. So again, it's about building that habit of mind around, do I need to or should I go back to the text for this question? And then where will I find the proof or the evidence that I'm looking for? So the 3 questions are really around why, when, and where should I look back? So the second section of activities are all specific strategies for note taking. So note taking, annotating, recording information when gathering that evidence. Post-its. We all love post-its. I love post-its. We, as teachers, some of us use them a lot. She does bring up a really good point about ensuring, this goes back to the planning, ensuring that the size of the Post-it matches the amount of writing that you're expecting from the students. She also gives a tip about keeping it focused, and one way to do that is always to ensure or keep that expectation of one idea per Post-it note. Poetry. We are going to come back to this in a moment. A great choice of text to work with, especially when we are thinking about and analyzing author's word choice. Story maps, we are, of course, familiar with, but there are some more detailed examples or variations of a typical story map provided in the chapter, because we know that as kids, as students progress through the upper grades, the texts and the narratives that they're being asked to read become more complex. And so often the narratives have a more complex chronology, subplots, and a variety of devices that might benefit from a more detailed story map. And then finally, annotations. So there's a fantastic strategy for annotating characterization. And there are specific systems for coding different character elements during close reading. So first the students are taught a code, then they annotate the text while keeping one particular character in mind. Then they record the coding and the evidence into a table, a sort of graphic organizer. And then as a last step, they have the code, the evidence, and then they finally infer an adjective or a character trait that might go with what the evidence is showing about that particular character. I love this. It's a rich strategy. Dr. Mesmer explains, though, that, of course, it isn't a natural process for students or something that would come easily at all. It would require a lot of modeling, a lot of practice, especially in terms of learning those different codes for annotating the text.
Nellie, I'm just going to jump in there for a second.
Please.
Some of the people with us tonight might have heard about Think SRSD, which is a writing strategy. And it's really quite neat. So I've been working with it. I took the course in the summer, and there is color coding, as we know, and each color coding is 4 different colors used. And at first I had a terrible time remembering which color went with which, but it becomes really natural, as you said, with practice modeling. My students have it, like sometimes I actually grab the marker or the wrong color, and the kids are like, but Anne, that's not the right color. So with practice, it really becomes super clear, and is just such a helpful tool for them, allowed to see the various pieces together. So I think that's a great point. It can seem complex, but as we know, with practice and good instruction, it becomes second nature.
Absolutely. Thank you. Okay, and so this brings us to not our first breakout room, but our literacy lounge, where you are invited to participate however you choose, depending on how you're feeling this evening. So we are going to look at a poem. On page 90 of this chapter, Dr. Mesmer shares 3 reasons why starting with poetry is a great option. They're short, relatively short, and accessible. They can be reread multiple times quite easily, or she actually says, without taxing the reader. And lastly, they're an excellent type of text for, as I mentioned a few seconds ago, analyzing word choice. So these are the steps, again, in more detail in the chapter, that outline a lesson sequence for teaching a poetry lesson. The book also includes a sample, I believe one or two samples of a think aloud script that you could use that provides some guidance for how you might think aloud to model this for students. So of course, oh, just lost my pen. Of course, the first step is always to prepare, right? We know that things go much more smoothly when we've made intentional choices and really looked through the text and thought through the decisions, the instructional decisions that we're making ahead of time. So not really the first step, but the pre-first step. So step one would be the teacher reads the poem aloud to the students. Then we have the students read the poem themselves. The students then reread the poem with a guiding question that we've provided with them to allow for some focus while they're rereading it a second time. And that's bolded because we're going to come back to that in a moment. The next step would be to have a class discussion to unpack things such as themes, devices, again, whatever your learning goal would be for that specific lesson. Highlight and define keywords. And finally, analyze word choice, followed up by another teacher-led discussion. So what we're actually going to ask you to do for this literacy lounge is Una is going to put a link in the chat that will take you to a poem entitled Rock the Boat. And I'm anxious to see what our reactions are going to be to that poem. We're going to ask you to take the time to read the poem and think about a guiding question that could be provided to students as they're asked to read it on their own.
Okay, welcome back. And on your screen, thank you so much for taking the time to read parts or all of that poem called Rock the Boat. And thank you so much to adding to our potential guiding questions. And you can see on the screen, if you want to take a quick moment, what other people, it sounds like somebody's not muted there. You can see what other people thought could work as a potential guiding question. So wonderful ones that are connecting to, real life circumstances. Name a situation during recess when you knew that it was important to rock the boat. I love that, connecting it to real life. How did you handle that situation? Oops, it's just scrolled up on me.
I
There
love
we
the
go.
simplicity of some of these, like, why would
Mm-hmm.
someone rock the boat?
Mm-hmm.
You know,
I love that, because with that way they could
that,
investigate what that might mean, right? Like that might
exactly.
be a new expression.
And how could it feel in someone's body to rock the boat? So
Mm-hmm.
we were talking about pulling out the expression or talking about tightening in the chest.
So just a quick glance at what others thought could work, and all of these would be absolutely wonderful ways to guide students through that poem and reading that poem and unpacking it. And so folks, you're going to have to bear with me. I managed to close everything, and this is where you'll see if I can retrieve my ability. Oh, look, people are still adding. Thank you so much. So yeah, who would this apply to? personal experience.
So great. And
So great.
not sure about the rest of you, or if anyone, I mean, feel free to pop something in the chat. But when Leigh found this poem and shared it with me, I think I had goosebumps. It was so powerful and rich on so many levels, especially in the upper grades, and thinking about so many different things that we could connect it to. Another thing, just before Leigh takes you through the resource that actually, the amazing website where this poem lives, one of the places I'm sure it lives, as we were preparing, it was also a good reminder for us to be aware of how it can be challenging sometimes when we're not working with a paper copy. And so when we're at times asking students to work with a digital version of a text, some kids are super skilled and adept at doing that, but just important to recognize the added layer that digital text might present for some learners. So Leigh, I'm going to pass it over to you to take us through that website.
I just have to get back to sharing my screen, Nellie, so
No
you'll have to
problem.
give me a second.
And I see a question in the chat while you do that.
Great, I'll let you handle that while I take us back.
Leigh, is there a way for us to have a link to the Menti results so that we can have copies of those questions too?
Absolutely, there is.
That's a Leigh question. Yeah.
That's a great question. I will try to figure that out towards the end. And especially once we're done our time together, if the person that would like that sticks around, I will help them. We will absolutely. And we thought the same thing. We chose to do it that way so that we would have a record, and that way people have other possibilities as they maybe use that poem in their own classrooms. Okay, so here we go. We're going to take a quick look. Thank you all again so much for participating and reading through that and giving those guiding questions some thought. We wanted to share where that came from, and maybe you've heard about Common Lit, maybe you haven't. There's a wide variety of resources available, and this is simply one piece of the puzzle that we could use. Common Lit is free. And it is American, so some of the pieces would be American, but you can see that some of them would be applicable to all teaching. So that beautiful poem came from Common Lit, and I am going to try to quickly take us into it. And so actually, if you have used Common Lit, would you mind letting us know in the chat box? Because maybe you'll be able to answer some questions as well. So I log in with Google because that's something that my board does allow, I think. I've been told otherwise, so I do until somebody says don't. So you can see it takes you to an open page. Some of the features are paid features. Nellie, are you able to see my screen?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. Some of those features are only available if you have a paid subscription, but the part that we used and access to prepare for some of this was simply the text library. So we browsed the library. And so it is useful from grades 3 right up to, I believe, grade 12. So it really is applicable to the grades that we are working with. And so I simply went to grade 4 because that's what I teach. And I went along the top menu. You can see that there's some categories, and Nellie and I knew that we wanted to work with poetry. So we simply scrolled along, but you can see there's tons of great topics and categories, and we went to poetry. And so within poetry, then there was a number of great poems. We did take a closer look at a few of them. You can see that, and these are, established pieces of work with established authors. And we chose, as you can see, to use Rock the Boat. And so there's the poem, as you can see, and there is a PDF download, which is what we use to generate that. But even within that, there are all sorts of things that we can do. So you can see that there's a teacher overview. There are guiding questions, which are linked here with the numbers. There is some vocabulary work. So all of these numbers represent words that you might actively, so tier 2 vocabulary that you might work with your students to deepen their understanding of. And then there's also the assessment questions. So you can actually print off assessment questions to sort of have students look back at the text and gather evidence from the text to answer them. And students can annotate right on this. It can be read aloud to them. I tried the translating tool, not that effective in French, but that was not the purpose of it. And so we just wanted to bring Common Lit to your sort of radar because it can be a really lovely place to get some information on how to work through some really great pieces of text. So you can see that the author of this was the Young People's Poet Laureate for the Poetry Foundation just a few years ago. And so some really well-known authors, some really great pieces of writing that are there and available to all of us. Let's see if I can get back. Okay, did I put my speaker's notes back?
Retrieval practice.
I know. See, I
Love
had
it.
them up. I'm not sure what I keep doing. Nobody look at my speaker's notes, hiding them. There we go.
All
I think
good.
okay.
Perfect.
There we go. Okay, so Nellie, I didn't see, had anyone put in the chat that they were aware of Common Lit?
Lori has been playing around with it a bit, but
Oh,
not
right on.
in a position to answer questions yet. So
Okay.
maybe, hopefully, we've shared something new for many people, which is kind of exciting.
It would be.
Yeah. Okay. So here we go. This quote gives us a little bit more of the why of this work. And it comes from the chapter summary, but really applies well to both chapters, could easily come at the end of both. The beginning of this quote states, as intermediate grade students become more and more skilled at digging into the text, they build capacity for the demands of secondary school literacy, which requires more critical evaluation and analysis of texts, which makes us think of, what is required of students moving beyond grade 8 into secondary and even post-secondary, even that college and university level, and just how much practice is needed to get them to be successful at that point. Connecting back, to the instructional hierarchy, we're really thinking about getting them to that generalization application stage in terms of these skills, in terms of gathering evidence effectively in text. And it's also always helpful to remember that just because we've taught it doesn't mean they've learned it, right? And asking ourselves that question, being reflective, and seeking out, have they internalized the skill? Can they apply it without prompting and in new contexts?
And so that,
yeah, go ahead.
sorry, Nellie.
No worries.
Is it you? Is it me?
It's you.
Okay, perfect. So now we are on chapter 5, which was the second portion, the second chapter that we will read tonight. And that is gathering evidence from informational text. And so this is where in classrooms we tend to spend probably more of our time, which isn't to say that narrative or literary texts aren't important, but simply that academic and authentic life situations will likely involve informational text, as Nellie just mentioned. If we sort of think about student and life trajectories, it really is probably more so around informational texts. And of course, much of the same principles and ideas apply to both sets of texts, which we will look at towards the end of tonight. And so this was a quote that was at the start of the chapter. It was from a teacher. And perhaps you felt like Yvette, the teacher at the beginning of this chapter, who had been teaching for years and thought that her students understood how to read informational text and how to locate information in passages and answer those text-based questions. But in fact, she found out that she was wrong. We want to teach our students to truly leverage text evidence in the service of comprehension. And that comes from page 108. And of course, like so much of what we do, this requires explicit instruction and those opportunities to practice in order to be able to generalize and apply to all pieces of text. So the purpose of reading informational text is to learn and to build knowledge. Our brain stores information in specific ways. When we come across new information, we sort that into an existing schema or create a new place for it to go and to be added to. Remember that a schema is simply a cognitive way of storing information, kind of like file folders in our brain. And so this isn't always just about activating prior knowledge, it's about building it and building upon it. And this source of knowledge is the textual evidence. Students must understand the purpose and the macro structure of text because they can vary quite a bit. We spoke earlier about how there tends to be an element of predictability to literary or narrative texts. The purpose of informational text impacts their structure or their organization and how they convey the big idea. And when readers understand this, they know where to search for that textual evidence. Students need to be able to look beyond the words because informational text reading isn't really just about reading the words. In fact, only about 50% of the information might actually come from the text itself. The rest comes from the diagrams, figures, graphs, photos, maps, etc. And students must be taught to learn or taught to use those features. And in the text, Dr. Mesmer uses the example of learning about bird migration and how this requires students to use and read a map. In my class in grade 4, we are currently studying sound in science, and we've had to do some introductory learning around sound waves using diagrams. And you can imagine those just look like waves unless students have some knowledge about them. And so we've done some active teaching and learning about that. And finally, there is very much a place, of course, for non-text-based questions when reading informational text. We should include and model making predictions, connections, visualizing, and using prior knowledge. And so, as always, we want to be thinking about our lesson and learning goals when we work in any area. And the ones in this area include having our students be able to use text features to find text evidence. Really, that's the bulk of what we've looked at tonight. Ask questions before, during, after, because as Nellie said, it really deepens the understanding around what students read. And use various ways of note-taking during reading. And I just think of the number of times that I really did not do a great job of teaching students how to do that and how much learning it requires in order to do it well. You know, not capturing every word, of course, organizing our note-taking into usable pieces. And it really does require students be taught, modeled, guided, and then just so much practice and feedback of that skill.
And so this chapter actually features even more activities. If you haven't had a chance to read the chapter or dig into it, you might consider doing that because there are many valuable strategies and activities to dig into. For informational text, she has them divided into 3 sections. So text features, strategies around note-taking, and then strategies around generating questions. So we will go briefly through them and then again hone in on one that we found to be really interesting and hopefully high impact. So learning text features, all of the first group of activities are based on this idea. And text features, we know for informational text, are a huge component, and they can often provide as much information as the text itself. And we know that many students don't pay close attention to the text features. Headings specifically can provide a bit of an advanced organizer for the content that is going to follow. And so on page 113, actually, the author outlines a brief step-by-step outline of how we might want to attack the teaching of headings with students. And so the purposes of some text features can be taught quickly, right? And it's just a matter of maybe reminding students how to use them or calling attention to them when they pop up in text, such as italics or bolded words, captions. But then we know, as Leigh just mentioned, in terms of a graphic, about sound waves, that there can be more complicated features like charts and graphs. And Dr. Mesmer also offers a sequence to follow. She uses a line graph as an example. There's a bit of a script. And basically the steps that she goes through are to, first of all, collect and explore different examples, so models of the specific type of graph that you're trying to teach the specific parts, and have students identify the purpose of that particular graphic or graph. And then thirdly, for how to read or interpret the graph, she shares this type, title, patterns strategy, where for type, they're identifying the type of graph and its purpose. They're then reading the title to match it up to the data presented in the graph. And thirdly, patterns, so type, title, patterns, is the step where they would be actually observing the data and looking for trends or patterns that they see. Okay, The second chunk or batch of activities revolve around note-taking strategies. So we have extended anticipation guides, and some of us are familiar with kind of a traditional anticipation guide, but this one adds an after reading part. It does require careful previewing of the text and planning those statements ahead of time by us. And really, the three purposes of this type of organizer are to activate prior knowledge, to increase motivation, and then to have students find, of course, go back and gather that evidence from the text. Another strategy is outlining, where students are pre-reading the text loosely to create a general outline just based on the headings. And as part of this strategy, something that's really important is teaching students, and I'm sure many of us have come across this, where we teach students to write point form notes or bullet points, and they have a really hard time. They really need that instruction around what is that difference between a point form or bullet note versus a complete sentence. So that's part of this strategy. And then the outline can be used for oral discussion or summary writing, or other activities afterwards. The third one is writing a heading, which is exactly how it sounds. Students create a heading for a passage. And, in this case, we would obviously want to model while thinking aloud, and always going back to that guided and independent practice. Pattern guides. Pattern guides are essentially graphic organizers, but that are partially completed ahead of time to provide a bit of a scaffold for the students, and especially helpful with longer texts. Next, we have the text features review. The preview, sorry. I think there's a typo on our slide there. It should say preview. And it really primes students for reading attentively. And it is a strategy that helps activate their attention before they dig into the actual text. And again, I'm, going over these quite quickly and briefly, but if any of them captures your attention, there are far more, many more details in the chapter to explain them further. Lastly, annotation system. So really teaching students systems for marking up a text that make their thinking visible. And this is, really a habit of mine that is lifelong, a useful way of getting students to connect with the text, engage with the text. And we would say initially, of course, less is probably more. We don't want them to be so caught up in the specific coding that they're taken out of the text. And then, eventually when students are in that generalization adaptation stage of the instructional hierarchy, and they're managing and monitoring their own comprehension, they may be developing their own coding system. I know that I have like stars and hearts and things that I use when I'm annotating books all over the place. And that's really when, you're in that adaptation stage, can apply to new concepts, and students can eventually create their own annotation system.
And I think you're so right in saying, Nellie, that sometimes less is more, because we've all been inclined, and when students are learning, highlighting everything. And so really being able to discern what is worthy of that annotation.
Absolutely. And I think on this slide, I'm going, in the interest of time, I'm just going to say that the third section is around having students generate questions before, during, and after reading. And this came up earlier tonight as a strategy for literary text. And I know that we mentioned that students grow the most when they're doing this. You may recall, if you were able to join us in our first session, that generating questions was also identified by the National Reading Panel as one of those 8 strategies with really robust support. So Dr. Mesmer in their chapter goes through 4 different types of questions. What we want to do is keep in mind that the point of guiding students through generating questions is to send them back to the text and closely read. So I'm thinking about, I don't know if anyone here was able to attend the IDA conference last spring, but Anita Archer did a really good job of reminding us to keep students in the text, not out of the text. So I'm going to pass it over to Leigh as she takes us through one last activity that we thought was really excellent and wanted to choose to highlight.
And of course, because it has to do with what we were just talking about, right, Nellie, like that generation of questions in order to deepen understanding. And so again, in the interest of time, I'm going to skip this slide, but this is the strategy that we're going to be looking at. It's called facts to questions, and it's a strategy that's highlighted on pages 121, 122. And we did summarize these on the next slide. So I'll just skip past this. And here it is again. Strategy is called facts to questions. It is a note-taking strategy. Students first record a fact. And again, you might be thinking about that one fact per post-it note sort of thing. And then they convert that question, or pardon me, that fact to a question. And we are going to show what this looks like. They suggest using a graphic organizer to do this work, and we're going to provide one. We said it looks more like a table, but it is a way of organizing this work. And then the really neat thing that we could see, the reason this brought bang for buck is that students can then trade questions amongst themselves to really have those rich discussions, to look back in the text for evidence in order to answer one another's questions, and as a strategy to deepen comprehension about actual content. And so we're going to do a little bit of this ourselves in a moment. And I chose, again, I teach grade 4, and we are going to be doing some learning around this very shortly. We are going to be looking at an expectation or a piece of reading that would support grade 4 social studies, heritage and identity, the early societies to 1500 CE. And we're going to be specifically looking at comparing aspects of early societies to life today. And so Una or Alicia, if you're able to pop that document into the chat, or Nellie, if you're able to, I could even give it a go. I don't know if one of you can. We're going to ask you to do this very thing. We're going to ask you to read a text. We've got another text there from Common Lit. And we are going to ask you to read that text. It is a longer one, it's 2 pages. And then we're going to ask you to pull out a fact. In fact, I might even be able to show this. There we go. Nellie, did that go in the chat? Or you? Yes, perfect. So we've linked the article that we're going to ask you to read there. Again, it's from Common Lit. We wanted to expose a little bit of that again. And it's a really interesting article that talks about the history of makeup in the past and how maybe it still connects with today. So we're going to ask you to read some of the text and then record, as we have below, a fact, and then convert that fact to a question. So I gave an example here around the text, or around lipstick and lip gloss and how it protected from the sun. So we'll give you maybe about 3 minutes just to maybe take a little bit of a read, grab any part of the article, read a portion, and see if you can come up with a fact, and then convert that fact to a question. Okay, we hate to rush people and we wish we had more time. We're going to let folks finish up their current question or fact. And of course, you have a record of that, so you're able to keep that to use yourselves or to draw upon. So if you take a quick look on the screen, I've made it nice and big so you should be able to see, but you can see you've added some incredible facts and then very quickly converted those to questions. And so you have a record of that. You can see those yourself, but some really great things that you might choose to use later this week. So a student's ability to find text evidence depends on foundational skills and proficiency when working with informational text. Obviously, those foundational skills, for example, note-taking, annotating, generating questions, using those text features, all of those things we've mentioned tonight have to be taught well so that they learn them and then practiced.
Okay, I'm going to wrap up as quickly as I can so we can go to the next slide. Leigh, thank you. Okay, so we thought just to, wrap up, there was so many common threads between both chapters that we just wanted to pull out some points that come, that are helpful to think about whether we're having students work with literary or informational text. So that need to recognize when to look back, knowing text structure and knowing text features of the specific type of text we're working with really helps. We can keep going there. The importance of having students monitor their own reading and then making those decisions for themselves about when, sorry, that's my dog, when and how to go back and find evidence in the text. And then strategies such as looking back, annotating, and that question generating are key across both types of text.
And so we were super excited to see there was so much in common because it looked a bit daunting to look at two different pieces of or approaches or different types of text. But Nellie, as we looked, we recognized that there was more in common that there wasn't.
Absolutely. And then just finishing off with that last, but definitely not least, that, piece about our own preparedness and intentional planning that saves time and maximizes learning outcomes for students in the end. Okay. I think there's a little clicky glitch there.
Yeah, there is. Nothing's really
Yeah, we
happening.
just have to, there we go. No, we
There
can
we
go
go.
back
I've
one.
overshot.
And we'd like to end as we always do. Can we just go back to that one quote,
course.
Leigh? And hopefully, this idea has come through tonight as we went through both chapters, the fact that locating evidence in a text is not as easy as it sounds, and that so many other skills that support close reading of text are needed to help students do this successfully. So locating textual evidence is not as simple as it seems. In reality, this skill requires students to develop a number of other skills, including understanding structures, analysis of text features, and self-monitoring skills, of course, among others. So there you go, Leigh.
Okay, so we just wanted, knowing that next week is our last session, we wanted to see if you have any burning questions that we could maybe help you with, or that we could bring to the table or and put in the forefront for some discussion next week. Or pardon me, not next week, in 2 weeks when we meet. And so if you do have questions or if there's something that you'd like to chat about a little bit further, we've provided our ONlit emails and we'd love to hear from you. And if you let us know if you have any questions or anything you'd like to discuss by Sunday, March 30th, that will give us some time to prepare for our last session, which is April 2nd. So we'll give you a quick second. Again, that's a Q&A that we would love to have in addition to the topic that night, which is stretching students within the text. And we're really excited to dig into that a bit too. Okay, so we did this one à la prochaine because we're both French immersion teachers. Until we see you next time on April 2nd, we're going to be talking, as we said, about stretching students in text.